Welcome to the D&D Fitness Radio podcast, brought to you by your hosts, Don Saladino from New York City and Derek Hansen from Vancouver, Canada.
Well, listen, I had a topic I wanted to cover today a little bit, and because I feel like we haven't really, we never really dove into this, and it's like, this is your lane, right? Like, this is what it is you're known for, and this is what it is you do. And, I wanted to kind of, because Derek, everyone knows Derek, I mean, my podcast partner here. He's always a little bit more of the quiet one, but he's definitely the one. And when he says something, I think it's the most valuable information. Every time you open your mouth, there's so much value to it. But I want to talk running today, right, Derek? Exactly. Now he's trying to, but I do. I want to talk running a little bit, right? Because, I had a challenger on the other day, and he's asking me, he's a little bit of a cluster of his training, of how he designs his programming. When not the stuff that I give him, but more of like, if he's running, there's a lot of different types of running he does. Like, he'll go out and he'll run a 10K, but then he'll be working on 400s, and then he'll be working on 100s, and then he'll be working on 5 mile, 6 mile, right? And he's just doing all of this stuff. And I think the example that I always give is, all right, listen, we can line up 20 ingredients that I might cook with, all really healthy ingredients. Now, you're going to use those ingredients separately. I might use 3 of them one day in this dish, or I might use 5 of them one day in this dish. But if we take all 20 ingredients and we throw it into one pot and we try and cook with those 20 ingredients, it's probably going to taste like shit.
Like, I'm writing an article on that, actually.
What's that?
It's called, and I got to send it to you before I publish it, but it's called, what do I call it? Exercise availability disorder. So the idea that there's so many exercises out there that people think they have to do them, as opposed to like you said, let's do 5, really good, right? But there's so many exercises, so it dilutes everything, right? So you're like, oh, that looked like, you go to a conference, oh, that's a good one, I'll add that one in. Oh, I saw this on Instagram, I'll add that one in. And it's like, then you got to, like,
Charlie, you just got Francis this pile. You got a pile of shit. Yeah, you literally, you said it nicely. You have a pile of shit. And we see it in all types of training, right? Like, I'll design a program for someone and they'll be like, well, I want to do this. And I'm like, you've been doing this for a year and a half. Like, let's focus on other things. And a term that I like to use is, a lot of training, at least I'd call big bang for your buck training, they have carryover, right? It's what I mean by carryover is like, okay, you could be deadlifting. Is deadlifting just training the lower back? Is it just training the leg? No, it's there are so many things deadlift's training that we don't look at as primary users, like our grip, right? Well, if our grip's getting stronger, what's happening to our shoulder strength? What's happening to the strength of our lats if we're really trying to bend that bar? What's happening to our core strength? What's happening to our hips and glutes? What's happening to our quads, our hamstrings? Like, there's so much carryover. There's so many things going on here. And if you think, all right, in a deadlift, if your chest isn't working, well, go up and touch a powerlifter's chest while they're deadlifting. You think they're not creating tension there? Right. So I understand how it's not a primary mover for certain muscle groups, but it has a lot of carryover. It's doing a lot of things. Now, running, I really believe has become somewhat of a lost art over the last few decades. And when I say that, it was almost bastardized for a period of time. People were like, oh, running's not good for you. Running's not good for you. Like, okay, like, squatting can be bad for you if it's performed by someone who doesn't know how to squat. Running can be bad for you if you have injury and you don't know how to run. Well, I'm someone that has always been a runner, but I took a little bit of time off of running. And I've been really consistent with my running the last month. And I feel great. I feel like I've regained a loss of elasticity in my body. I feel like that when I would go even attempt to sprint maybe 3-4 months ago, my hamstrings were tight. Now, from running 5 mile clips, 3 mile clips, I've reestablished a bit of that spring in there. How much carryover are we having from running to other things that we enjoy doing in life? And I mean, that's a pretty basic question, but first off, is running, you believe, something that most of us should try and never let go of and never lose the ability to do?
I mean, it's contextual. Like, you remember that diagram I would post, and it's called a motor unit diagram, and it was Charlie Francis and I put it together, where you got on the left side you have sprinting, Olympic lifts, and then you start moving over, you got squats, deadlifts, and then to the right you got like arm curls, wrist curls, right? So you have high motor unit activities, which essentially means a lot of muscles being used and a lot of brain power to fire those muscles. So anything to the left where it's explosive throws, clean and jerk, maybe even certain plyometrics and sprints, use a lot in your body. I remember I wrote this book for human kinetics called Plyometrics Anatomy, and they wanted to know, like, okay, tell me every muscle being used in each of the exercises, right? And I'm like, they're all being used. What do you mean? Like, so people, and again, maybe it comes from bodybuilding, where people like to target areas of the body. But if you look at, like, in running, and running is such a broad area, like it's sprinting, different types of sprinting starting, and then middle distance running, long distance running. But running is a whole body activity for sure. But I think you have to, it's like any training program. Like, I'm the opposite of you. I did more sprinting and running, and I got away from lifting. So guess what happened? A lot of joint pain, a lot of, issues like that, where I felt unbalanced. And so I got back into front squatting, back squatting, and all that. And it seems to have resolved it. So I now have something in there that's different, that's shoring up areas that maybe running doesn't. Whereas if you're a lifter, everything is slower, high tension for the most part. So if you, like, people will say, like, oh, I'm going to do velocity based lifting, and they attach something to the bar that measures bar speed. And so,
like
okay,
a tendo.
Yeah, I got it moving at 1.5 meters per second. Wow, that's really fast, right? Well, how fast does a baseball pitcher throw his arm at? How fast when you sprint, you have to get over 10 meters per second, right? And your limbs are moving even faster. So it's 10 times slower to lift. And then if you do like slower lifts, then it's like 20, 30, 40 times slower. So, your body has different abilities and roles. Your muscles have different roles, and fast twitch, slow twitch. And I guess you have to really target all of those things. Now, running does a good job for all the fast twitch and elastic components, but maybe not so much for the slower, high tension. So maybe isometrics, eccentrics, all these other things are really important. But I think you're always looking for gaps in your training and making sure that you're not shifting too far to one side. So running is not a bad way to kind of cover off a lot of those areas, those higher velocity, elastic areas, and there's a fluidity and a coordination amongst your muscles. Like, when your quad fires, your hamstring has to relax, right? So if you're doing that and you're running at 4 steps per second or faster, that has to happen. The demand for the velocity of turning something on, but also turning something off very quickly, is very
important.
High. Yeah, because if you don't have that coordination, like, there's a video I show of a sprinter racing against a bodybuilder, and the bodybuilder blows out both hamstrings like 5 steps in, because he can fire his muscles, but just not at that speed. So then things just blow up. So, it's I guess what I'm saying is, and what we've always said, is there has to be some sort of balance to your training that allows you to hit different areas, different functions, different energy systems. And if you don't, you're going to have a deficit somewhere, and be open to injury, or whatever.
The problem is, for most people, is that there is too large of a library of things to do, or things they think they need to do. One of the best examples I can ever use was, I think, probably 12 years ago. Now, because we're 3 years into COVID, it had to be 50, but right when Charlie Weingroff started work, Dr. Charlie Weingroff started working at Drive, and we have a mutual client, and I screened him, and I then found some red flags that were out of my scope. So I sat down with the client and Charlie ran this individual through, Charlie's screening process. I think it might have been an SFMA. What is it? So Selective Functional Movement Assessment, I think it stands for. And so Charlie runs him through, I might even be getting that wrong. So it's been so long since I've seen an SFMA, I'm actually forgetting what it stands for. And I sat down, I watched Charlie's assessment process, and Charlie gave me some basic things that he wanted to see improve in the programming. I said, great. So I went back and I sat down and I wrote the program, and I came back and I handed Charlie like this Chinese menu of things, practice, like in his, we call it at the time, we called it prehab, we called it movement prep, whatever you want to call it, but it really was my way of getting this client to practice things that he wasn't good at. And Charlie just looked at me and started shaking his head. And he's like, what? I'm like, what's the problem? He goes, Don, the main problem with this guy is he's hyper flexible. He didn't like using the term hypermobile because we always refer to mobility as the combination of flexibility and stability. So when people say hypermobile, it's like, we really preferred the term hyper flexible. Like they were just that this guy was like,
gumpy. As opposed to their joints dislocating.
Exactly. So it's like, it's really more like hyper flexible, right? So the guy had no control over his body. He had no stability. And he's like, Don, our client's hyper flexible. I was like, yeah, but I have this to improve, glute strength, and I have this to improve lat strength, and I have this. And he looks at me and he just goes, deadlift him. And I was like, holy shit. He's like, Don, think about it. If he's getting on the floor with the bar, which you can get into a perfect position with, and he's, ripping the bar apart and getting every area of his body to engage, he goes, run him like an old school Bill Starr 5x5 program where he's like 3 days a week, getting the big lifts, creating strength, percentages over a 12 to 16 week period of time. Take your time. Get this guy strong. So I'm like, okay, great. And that was like the first lesson to me that like this guy didn't need to stretch, right? Like he was always stretching. I'm like, wait, he doesn't need stretching. He needs stability. So what do we do in the warm-ups now? Light carries, med ball throws, things that we're going to still produce, the body to fire, but still create strength. And you know what? 2-3 days a week, we were getting him to do some form of deadlift, some form of squat, some form of bench press. And it was like magic, man. Every single week, you just saw things in his body start creating this tension. You saw maybe week one, his spine couldn't maintain. We had to go really light and just focus on tension techniques, or his knees would go valgus because he had no control over his legs. And with taking his time, we were able to check all the boxes that Charlie wanted me to check. And even in training now, there's so many aspects, so many different things that we like to do in our training, but I'm getting to the point with running where I'm like, oh, run. like when Charlie said to me about, the deadlift, even like sprinting in the beginning might be too demanding for someone to do, right? Mm-hmm. It's too much force. Like, and what did I start doing? Like in the first week or two, I went out and did a couple 3-mile runs during the week on specific days, Wednesdays and Fridays. And then out of nowhere, I jumped to 4 miles one day and 5 miles the other day. And then now I'm at 5 mile and 5 mile. And now I'm starting to feel a little bit more springy. Now towards the end of my run, I'm starting to feel like I can keep going. I'm not feeling like, I'm beat up. And I'm turning around and I'm noticing, like, after the run, what will I do? I'll go and I'll stretch some areas of my body, which I know get tight on me, right? Like I'm stretching, I'm doing a couch stretch for quad and hip flexor. I'm doing some type of like an inverted hamstring for my hinge and to work on a little bit of, stability, right? And I'm working on the hip 90-90 with the kettlebell and the hips because, that's going to help, loosen up my hip flexors and get my hips, rotating internally and externally. And just basic things like that are really just opening up. And now I'm waking up and I'm like, oh my God, like for the first time in a long time, the first time since, are you ready? I was on a strict running program back in 2020 during COVID. I did Omega Waves adaptive running plan, which had me running 3 days a week. And it really started me off with a lower intensity and it had me building my aerobic base. And then in time, what I saw in the program was it started getting me into more higher intensity, more interval style of training. And then on days I was coming in and my Omega Wave was measuring my readiness and it was saying, all right, sleep wasn't great, stress is high. It would get me doing longer duration runs where the heart rate is really low. And I turned around and I turned into a beast again running, which it was like years and years since then. But my body felt better. and I started getting that spring back in my step. And sometimes I think we get away from things. And the reality is we have to continue. Maybe during the year you can phase in and out, or design things differently according to, you know, where you are in your training year. But you know, it's something where the more times I keep coming back to it, the more times I'm like, man, I better make sure I'm doing this when I'm 80.
Yeah, I had a couple of interesting conversations the last few days, and it's mostly been with people from your background, which is baseball and golf.
Yeah.
And so they came to me to come up with some strategies to offset the stress of their sport. So one was pitchers, you know, and I don't know if you saw about Ohtani. I think he messed up his elbow.
Oh, did he really? I didn't see that.
I think so. He might need Tommy John. I'm not sure.
Are you serious?
Yeah. So they might still have him hitting because he's got 44 homers, but he's not going to be pitching. But so, you know, we talked about pitchers because of the overuse possibilities of throwing too much, right, at high velocities. So we're talking about short sprints to compensate for doing a little less throwing and generating it through lower body, but also doing them on the same timer as the pitch count, which would be like, what is it, 15 to 20-second intervals or something like that. So that was interesting, and they found that the pitchers liked it. It was better than giving them something in the weight room or you know, something, you know, related to throwing. And then I had a local pro here who has a lot of international athletes at different age groups. He wanted something for driving power that's not going to, again, there's a lot of rotational prescriptions in both those sports, right? Like med ball, rotational med ball throws. And if you got a lot of back pain, you want to be careful with that. So now we're coming up with the same prescriptions, like short sprints, and short might be 5 yards, walk back, do it again, do it like a lot of times, like 10, 20 times, right? And everybody has reported better results, less problems with injuries. So again, you're finding something different to accomplish the same thing neurologically, or that whole idea that you talked about is carryover and transfer, and having an effect on something without actually doing that exact thing. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that you've identified with the running modality.
Now, when someone's training for sprinting, right, or someone's training for distance, there's always become that question of adding in, like, if you're a distance runner, you know, at certain training blocks during the year. I know a lot of distance runners I'm friends with, they will do a block of speed training, or they will be mixing in shorter distance speed work. One of my challengers, who's an ultra marathoner, her name's Fleur. She's in New Zealand. She runs, you know, 100-mile clips. And, you know, recently she got into a block of training where she really kind of calmed down her distance work, and she started working on speed work. And she found out that really helped increase her performance on her distance work. Right? Is that something where you feel like, because for years when I played college baseball, my coach had us running 5 miles like all the time, 3-mile runs, 5-mile runs, 3-mile runs, 5-mile runs. And then there was a period of time where they're like, why would you have golfers running distance? Why would you have baseball players running distance? Like, but you're still creating this aerobic base. You're still creating this maintenance of elastic work, because you have to spring off the pavement. It is a unilateral movement. There is, you know, some type of this locomotive like movement going on with the arms and the body, and there's twisting and rotating and all these things that'll benefit us. Where I felt like for a decade plus, we went into this phase of it's bad, don't have them do it. Are you looking now and saying, well, maybe it's not so bad? Or do you think, you know, athletes should be staying away from distance running? Or do you believe it is going to lay down this aerobic base and this level of resiliency that they need? And also from a mental approach standpoint, there's something really peaceful and nice about going out for a middle distance run.
I think you have to individualize, right? So I've been involved, you know, with prescribing running for over 30 years. And some people are okay. They're durable, mechanically, they're fine. So if you send them on a longer run, or their nervous system, fits with that, where if you send somebody who's a little more fast twitch, anxious, they may not do well with a 30-minute run. They just can't. They might, it's too much time to get inside their own head. Whereas other people find it restorative and therapeutic, and even from a mental health perspective, really enjoy it. So that's one piece. The other piece is the mechanical piece, where some people, when they run long distances, they'll complain of like low back pain, knee pain, joint pain, and especially if they're taller and heavier. So you have to be careful. Like, you're not going to take, a 300-pound lineman or a basketball center and say, like, let's go for a long run.
Of course.
But if you find somebody who does well and doesn't mind it, then it's probably a very efficient way, as opposed to jumping on a bike, or even swimming. Obviously there's a huge skill component to swimming, but it's hard to, you have to put in a lot of mileage and a lot of time to generate the same amount of sort of cardiac benefit and caloric consumption in the pool. And same with cycling, you got to cycle a lot. So running tends to be one of the more efficient ways to achieve that. And you don't have to get up into the high heart rates. You could just, stay in, upper levels of zone 2, lower levels of zone 3. But I think, I heard that Roger Clemens did a lot of longer distance running as a baseball pitcher. And Charlie Francis always told me, like, there's a huge component, a low level aerobic component to something like pitching, which is intermittent, but you have to stay warm and you have to have a good circulatory system so that everything in the body stays warm, even when you go sit down between innings. I would say the same with golf, where it's a lot of walking, maybe standing, and then you got to swing that club pretty hard and furiously. So you better have this ability to stay warm and keep your tissues warm. So that's where the aerobic, circulatory system comes in. It's not like golf is a marathon. I mean, it is in some sense in terms of the duration, but not the same energy cost. But you have to stay warm, you have to stay supple. So I think that's where that aerobic component, the long distance running being an efficient way to achieve that, works. And it's very scalable. Like, you can have a whole team do it. And I think where it gets out of hand is when people start putting in a watch on it and saying you have to hit this time. And like I said, everybody's different. Everybody's going to achieve different heart rates. So I think you have to individualize, and you can't go over the top with it. And then you have this intermediate zone where people want to run repeat 300s with low recoveries. Or I find in college soccer, especially female soccer, they're having them do a lot of like repeat 120-yard runs.
Yeah.
I don't know why, because the field's not even that long. And if you do that, you're out of position. So somebody somewhere thought, wow, 120 really kicks my ass, so let's just do a lot of those. So I think, as long as you have a rhyme or reason.
Are they thinking, sorry to interrupt, but are they thinking if you overshoot the distance, then less distance is going to be, who was it? Ryan Reynolds told me recently that I think they put a monitor on one of their star, European footballers, for Wrexham, this guy Mullen, and Mullen, like in one match, like ran the equivalent of
like 12, 15K.
12, yeah, it was like 15 miles or something like that. It was like something crazy. And so there you're like, oh wow, like for someone to go on the field for, what is it, 90 minutes and be able to produce, how many minutes is 90? 90. It's 90 minutes. So to be able to produce that type of output over a 90-minute period of time, and to be able to get, that to me is like, okay, well, so are they thinking by overshooting the distance?
It's like an over distance approach, right? For anything, right? So, but I mean, on the other hand, like now they've put GPS on Messi, who's considered the best player in the world by far. And he walks a lot, and he doesn't run a lot because he's very intelligent. And he knows where to be. He knows how to anticipate. He knows how to walk to the position where he's going to receive the ball. And then he scores like he's got 10 goals in 6 games out of Miami. And he's just destroying everybody because he's so hyper intelligent. So I think you have to balance that off, because it's so easy to do the over distance thing and go, well, we're going to overcompensate and make sure that they can handle anything. But there's a cost to that. Like there's a wear and tear cost to that, and it's not very efficient, right? And so a lot of the soccer teams that I've worked with, we've kind of broken it down and said, okay, what, not what the minimum distance is, but we have to be careful. It's a long season, and if you're running a lot as a soccer player, it means you're probably not very good. Like you're probably making up for deficiencies technically, covering other people's asses because they're out of position. And so maybe that guy's running too much. And there's going to be a wear and tear cost on that guy. So you have to be really careful. It's definitely a science, but certainly there's an art to understanding how much running somebody needs, because it's so easy to go, screw it. I'm just going to run, I'm going to over prepare for this marathon, and I'm going to run, 28 miles a day as opposed to 26. And it's like, no, that's not a very, intelligent way of approaching it, because you're going to run into problems.
Oh yeah. And I saw that specific events I've had to approach in the past. And when you're jumping into it, you might be feeling a little bit insecure. And then out of nowhere, you're preparing whatever it is, 5 days a week. And then your body's getting hit. And then the next thing you know, like I remember the Navy SEAL swim that I swam in last year. I didn't know what to expect. The currents are brutal. And I remember in the beginning, it was like 4 or 5 days a week. And then towards the end, I dropped to like 2 to 3 days a week. And I actually felt that like I was recovered, I was rested, and I was still able to, produce this level of improvement with doing something 2 to 3 days a week. From a running standpoint, when you have your general, I'm not talking about Olympians, I'm talking about general pop, someone who wants to go out there and they want to improve their, 3 mile, 5 mile, 10 mile, like, is that something where they need to be doing that 5 days a week? Or do you think they can get away with 2 days, 3 days a week if they're doing other training and their activity levels high?
I mean, I always, whenever I write training programs for people, you have to find out, okay, well, what can you fit into your schedule? Like, average people have jobs and kids and things like that, and hobbies. So you have to find out, okay, how many days of the week can you sacrifice? And then you start dividing up and go, okay, maybe 2 of those days are longer runs because you're working on that low level aerobic system. And then you have maybe another day where they do something shorter and faster. So it's faster than their race pace, their desired race pace. So you can work on more of a speed component. And then maybe there's another day where there's some other intervals that, instead of running, like say you normally go out and run a 5K. Well, why don't we do 5 times 1K with 2-minute breaks, right? So you can, again, you're getting over race pace. Maybe your 1K time when you run your 5K, your 1K split is like 4 minutes 30. Okay, well, when we run these individual 1Ks, let's run them in just under 4 minutes, and then you get your 90-second break or 2-minute break, and then let's do it again. So your body adapts to a faster pace under a sort of a manageable condition. Because I think sometimes, if you're like me, if I go for a long run, my brain is racing like, well, why am I doing this? I just think too much. So if you subdivide your training into smaller bits, sometimes it's a lot more manageable and more interesting, because you're like, okay, let's just focus on this 1K, and then you reset your brain for the next one. Okay, let's attack another one. But if you're doing 5K in a row, it's easy to wander, fall off pace, lose sense of your mechanics. And so you want to just divide it up, divide and conquer kind of thing.
But in the beginning, when someone's new to it or someone's just getting started, does it really matter? Do you really have to be that technical? Or can you just say, by completing, the run and staying in maybe a zone 2, that in itself is going to be beneficial enough?
I always like making people do shorter things that are manageable, and then started, extending it, right? So, and the reason being is that from a technical point of view, it's easy to say, like, just go easy and run 5K and take, 35, 40 minutes, whatever it is. But it's probably going to be pretty sloppy. And so as opposed to doing that, why don't we start with some shorter things? And it might be going to the track. And I like using the track because a quarter mile is a lap. Mm-hmm. And then you can do a lot of math off a quarter mile. Like let's figure out what your quarter mile pace is when you're running, a 2 mile, and you're like, okay, it has to be 90, say it has to be 100 seconds to do a lap. Well, let's see you do some 90-second laps easy. So it's, I just like dividing stuff up for even beginners. Like there's a lot of there's a local 10K here, the Vancouver Sun Run they call it, and they get people to do walk jog programs. So they walk 2 minutes, jog 2 minutes. That's how they get them started. And I guess that's not a bad way of doing it. They subdivide it out, and people will do it in their neighborhoods. I'm a little more scientific, so I'd like to know, rather than just time, how much distance are you covering, and then relate that time to that distance. So that's why I like the track, even though it's boring and you're only going one direction. But we all have, smart watches now, and we can use GPS to figure out what our rate is, like our, time per mile or time per kilometer. So it's not a bad idea to have some sort of recording and monitoring of what you're doing, so that the next time you can set a goal and go, okay, that was the speed that I was running last day for this distance. Either you're going to do more volume, or you're going to do the same volume and maybe run it a little faster. So as long as you're tracking, I think that's just a better way to do it, to have some sort of organization, because it's so easy just to say, I'm going to go for a 20-minute run. Well, what did that look like? What did it look like technically? What did it look like from a performance point of view? What was your heart rate? Like, measuring is not a bad thing. It's a little, some people get out of hand with it, but I think it's valuable in order to, make the most of your time spent exercising. Because like you said, if you only have 2 or 3 times a week, well, let's make sure that's the best possible training session you can have for where you're at in your training.
Right. So look up, speaking to the general public, someone wants to get into running twice a week, right? And they want to start developing that, building up that aerobic base. What would you recommend? How would you recommend them to approach that?
It might be, again, it might be something where you're doing like a defined distance. Like, hey, I mean, if you're an absolute beginner with no running background, that might mean like a 60 seconds on, 60 seconds run, 60 seconds walk, right? So you have some recovery time, and it's not so long that you're going to be stumbling through the run and just feeling horrible. So maybe you have your watch beep every minute. It's easy enough to set that up with most watches now. And you jog for 60 seconds, and then you walk for 60 seconds. So a 1-to-1 kind of work to rest ratio. And then you say, like, let's do that for 10 minutes. Again, if I'm an absolute beginner and my fitness is questionable, 10 minutes of 5 runs plus 5 walks is probably manageable for most people. And then at least if you start with that structure, as opposed to saying, I'm just going to do a 10-minute run, then you can start to build on it and go, well, I can go the same distance, but now I can make them 30-second recoveries, so that I kind of squeeze the recoveries and I put more demand on the runs. Or maybe they're 2-minute runs with 1-minute walks. And then you just kind of build it out from there. That's a really easy way to do it. And then once you get to a point where like, hey, I'm pretty fit now, well, now you can run 10 minutes on continuously, and then maybe it's a 3-minute walk, 10 minutes, 3 minutes, right? And you're just manipulating this work to rest ratio and building your volume, because that's how you get better at anything. Like more reps in playing tennis, or more reps at throwing a football and getting that volume in, or it's going to be more time running. And so just understanding that volume has to grow to a certain point for you to get better, and then at some point then you got to work intensity and run a little faster, and then you can get a little more scientific about how you structure your workouts. But I would say something as simple as doing a running, like they used to call it, like a fartlek. Remember that term?
Yeah, of course.
Right. So it's intervals. It's, you run for a bit, then you rest, walk, whatever, jog. And that's what it may grow into, is like you do faster segments and then you do a little jog in between. So 1 minute harder, 1 minute jog. And I'll do that on the treadmill, the curved treadmill. We've done that before. So it becomes more of a tempo workout. But I think identifying what you can accomplish early on, and then setting some goals around, okay, let's see if I can do that for 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes, this on-off type of approach, and then grow it from there, whether it's by growing more volume or adding some speed to those runs.
Yeah, we've invited my friends leaving right now. They're heading back into New York City. So I mean, basically you're breaking it down where you can obviously, as a beginner, you recommend the interval work early on because you feel like technically they're going to be able to maintain that proper technique. They're going to be able to take a little bit of a break mentally and physically to where they're going to now be able to repeat at a high level of competency. So when you're training distance running, I mean, distance running in shorter bursts, technique's going to change, right? So what do you normally tell to someone who's used to running, 5 miles, 7 miles, 10 miles, but then they want to get into, more sprint work, more bursts? Are you mainly just talking about knee drive? Are you talking about more hands, pocket to chin? Are you talking about more spring, right? When they're doing the sprint work, like how are you coaching someone who's trying to live in that general fitness area and they're trying to do a little bit of both?
So what you're asking was really like technique. What am I focusing on?
Yeah.
I would say if you're doing longer distance running, it's not as important to be like, get your hands up, get your knees up, because you don't need that kind of power. And if you get your hands up and your knees up, you're going to burn out really quickly. You can do that in different drills. And we've done some of those drills, like the marching and the skipping and the running high knees over distance are in place. And I think I would focus on that aspect, or if you're doing speed work, on focusing on getting your hands up higher and going through full range. But if you watch a lot of long distance runners, they're very efficient and they kind of stay a little lower with their arms. There's not a lot of arm movement because, as you know, if you get your arms moving while you're exercising, there's a huge energy cost. And so, you're trying to make sure they're conservative, they're symmetrical, they're not overextending, they're not, getting to extreme ranges of motion, because it's just going to burn them out. So I would say you can do the drills with the marching and getting them to higher ranges, because that's sort of like specific strength training that will transfer back to their long distance running. But I think you have to be really careful. Like, you can watch the Olympics and watch the 100 meters, but they're running that way because it's like 10 seconds. But if you watch the 5,000 or the 10,000 meters, everybody's very conservative until it comes down to the last sprint, the last 200 meters, when they're trying to outkick the opponent. So, I think as long as you feel balanced and relaxed, that's the most important thing, because as soon as the shoulders tighten up, then the chest tightens up and the rib cage and the neck, and then now you're fighting yourself and it's harder to get that air in. So that's the most important thing, I think, is, and maybe that's why we talked about the intervals working better, because now you can manage that, as opposed to like go for a 20-minute run and then you can just feel like, I'll see people running in my neighborhood and they just think, okay, I just got to go for a long time. But it almost looks like they're being compressed as they're going. So their posture might be up here when they're starting, and then they're like down here because gravity is like forcing them into the ground. And that postural compression has a lot of consequences for your ability to bring air in and blow it out properly. And so I think you'll start seeing a lot of problems if your posture isn't set up properly, and that takes time, right? And I'm sure you do a lot of stuff with clients for making sure that core is strong, and there's like some endurance work around that transfers to running, because if you lose posture, whether you're sprinting or long distance running, there's going to be a consequence.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most valuable pieces of information you gave me when running was to feel springy. I think the example you gave me once was, imagine I had pogo sticks on my feet when I was running, and I think that really allowed me to stop overreaching in my run, because my stride would be really long, and instead I'm just hitting the belt, and it's almost like the springy feeling. Yeah. And I think when I found myself get springy, that's probably when I'm running well, that's what I feel like, whether it's more like, especially like middle distance, because I enjoy a middle distance run. I enjoy, that 5 mile range. But when I feel like I'm springy and I'm doing that, is when I feel like I'm doing my best running. And it actually feels a bit effortless. I feel sometimes we'll have a little too much tension, rather than just springing your feet and just kind of letting your arms just, feel that bounce a little bit. And I feel like your body follows.
Yeah, and then so the technique is right. So if somebody overstrides, they're going to break more, they're going to compress more. But that also I think a lot of the shoes, and you can comment on this as well, the shoe companies are trying to make the shoes a little more elastic and provide a little more return, right? And if you get your technique down, plus you have, some of these newer technology shoes, you're going to maximize your performance over time.
Right. I mean, what's your thought process now on establishing some sort of barefoot training when you are doing a short distance run, whether it's on a track or on a curved treadmill, feeling that actual spring and allowing yourself to not rely on the shoe as much, right? Because you got to admit, like, as much as I love a good running sneaker and how good it feels, are you turning things off in the foot, or are you inhibiting the foot or the ankle from being able to perform the way it was meant to perform?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because I'm seeing that. Like, I just wrote an article on Achilles tendon ruptures, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the shoes are too stiff. Like when I went to the Braves and they showed me, one of the players' shoes, it felt like a brick, like it
Wow.
didn't flex. And maybe that's to compensate. You could comment on this. I assume it's to compensate for the fact that when you're hitting and throwing, you're in the dirt. They want something stiffer to compensate for the dirt displacement.
Right.
But when they run and they hit the base, you can see that brick like flop
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
base. So
100%.
And the same with football. There's 11 Achilles tendon ruptures in the NFL right now this season, and they haven't played a regular season game. And
That's
back
terrible.
in the 80s and 90s, there were 4 every year, 4 or 5, and they're at 11. Last year there were 18. So, it's a multifactorial thing, but I think the shoes are being tuned up so much that, like you said, it's either taking the foot away from the strength of the foot away from the equation and driving everything into the Achilles and the calf. But there's consequences. So, I do a lot of the drills on grass or turf with people in bare feet. I'm very careful not to expose them to like the track with bare feet, because it's pretty punishing. So maybe there's a shoe selection. I always like maybe having them in a minimalist shoe for some of the drills and some of the treadmill work, so that they don't, sprain a toe or create any problem with the skin. Because something, the Vibrams, the old,
Oh
they
yeah.
look like a
Yeah.
glove. I thought
Yeah.
that was too little protection. Like, you even having a little bit of protection, even though the shoe is compliant, is going to be better than going after it barefoot.
I
I think.
liked it. I actually liked it, but I actually liked it, but I took my time with it, right? Like that, like
Yeah,
I train barefoot. Like I
yeah,
don't work out in sneakers. Um, and when I do some of my sprint work on the curved treadmill, I actually do it barefooted. My distance work, in the past, I have done it with Vibrams. Now I run a lot with Ons. But I feel like also with training now, right, and the fact that we have different modalities being offered. For instance, you work with a football player or a soccer player in the off season, where maybe back in the '80s they were running in their off season to produce, you know, that that benefit. Now I'm seeing a lot more athletes using battle ropes. I'm seeing a lot more athletes using airdyne bikes. I'm seeing a lot of athletes using sled pushes, and that could be set up to either, in my opinion, benefit you or maybe even hurt the runner. Depending, are you setting it up heavy? Are you setting it up light? Are you pushing? Are you pulling? Are you moving laterally? Like, what are you actually doing? There's Versa climbers. There's ellipticals. You have all these things now where you just didn't see them as much, whether they existed back then or not. You don't see them as much, and they're designed a bit differently also. And that's probably what I'm seeing more of. And I think it's something we don't hear a lot of coaches talking about, is that back in the 70s and 80s, it was much more, meat and potatoes type, right? It was much more basic. Get an athlete in the off season, Nolan Ryan would go for a run, right? Like he would, it was just, oh, I'm going to go run today. I'm going to go run 5.
or fighters like boxers, right?
Sure. Now it's like this, which obviously is going to produce an incredible response cardiovascularly. But think about the benefit that we're not, reaping from going out and feeling that impact and doing it regularly, to where it's never removed from our training diet.
Yeah, I think that comes back to our original point, is there's just too much choice
Right.
that it's diverting you from maybe the best choice, right? And
Right.
it's like, I used to watch that show with Gordon Ramsay, like the chef one where he'd go and overhaul a restaurant, and 9 times out of 10 they would look at their menu and it would look like a phone book or a Bible. And he's like, you got too much stuff in here. Like,
Right.
how can you be good at anything?
Right.
And then he would shorten down the menu, right? So I think on some level, and maybe this is the responsibility of the personal trainer. I don't know, but somebody has to take some leadership and go, okay, what do you really truly need? And, I want to make it exciting and I want to give you variety, but I want you to get better first and foremost. And I think that's the results piece is so important. Whereas, being entertaining and all that, just tell good stories while they do the same bloody squats all the
I
time.
couldn't agree with you anymore. I mean, I don't understand why you're working with a football player. I mean, granted, it's a lineman. I get it, but a lineman still has to run. Like a lineman who weighs 300 plus pounds still better know how to run. And what happens in that off season for 3-4 months when he stops running, or the soccer player, if he or she stops running and just gets on a bike, like, are we falling that short? And, really, and I mean, we can go on for this for hours here, but I think really in conclusion, my goal when working with someone is I am trying to get them to do specific movements, specific patterns that they were able to do when they were a kid. And I feel like when you don't use it, you lose it. And, I think at the very least, and to give you a little plug here, and I know this wasn't our intention, but I think your running mechanics program that I got on for 2 seasons, I think it was an incredible way to reintroduce running to me. But I think it's also a phenomenal way for for a very proficient runner to get a lot faster and a lot springy. Can you tell everyone where to find that program? If you're
Yeah,
I'm
like
not,
I have the 2 sites that I have are sprintcoach.com, which, essentially is running, but it's sprint focused. And the other one is runningmechanics.com. Those are the 2 sites. And one of them is more sort of products and consulting. And the other one is like courses, in person and virtual. So
perfect.
I'm really trying to, it's easy to say like I'm the running guy, but I'm trying to make sure it integrates with whatever else they're doing. And it's interesting you were saying, people are getting away from running and they're going and looking at, say, like you said, football linemen. They're like, well, every play is 4 seconds long, so he only needs to do 4-second bursts. And yeah, but I was just reading an article about the Kansas City Chiefs, and I know I'm familiar with them and their strength coach because I've been involved with them. But Andy Reid has some of the most demanding practices in training camp and
Right.
practices in season, right? And there's a lot of running, whether it's, and then you've probably heard this, like, there's no, and even in the military, you have to run to every drill. Like, so there's running involved in training camp that's not part of the game, but it's running to get to this position on the field or running off the field or, so guess what? You're going to have to run, even though the game itself is different. There's
Yep.
just a lot of running in football because
Yep.
that's how the practices are run. And so you better be in shape to handle all of these other things associated with the game of football, which is practice, training camp, whatever, running after your kids or, and I think people don't think of that. They think, well, I work in an office and I just want to look good. And yeah, but guess what? When I was working at a PT clinic, all the people that showed up with like tendon avulsions or major hamstring pulls and all that, they were running after their kids, running after the bus, running, whatever,
Yep.
running, functionally getting somewhere. And
Yep.
that's when they got hurt because they weren't prepared to run.
Right. At the very least, I mean, a thing I've been doing with a group of friends who are a bit older than I am is, I'll get them on the curve treadmill and I have them doing some very easy 15-second tempos just to get them feeling it and just to focus on technique and getting that spring. And every week we've been incorporating this in a couple of times a week. You're starting to see a little bit more bounce and you're starting to see technique clean up a little bit. And they're starting to feel like their bodies are feeling a bit better. So, the purpose of this conversation today was not to tell everyone to just jump right back into a 10-mile run, but at the very least, which I think is one of the best programs in the world, go check out Derek's program. Derek, thanks a lot for today, man. As always.
Everybody like your hammer strength treadmill?
Love it.
Good.
It's fantastic. Good.